The seminar of my topic this afternoon is the arts, and let me tell you a little bit about my journey, which is slightly different, I would imagine, for most of you, as it started in the Netherlands, which actually has a long tradition of Christian education. But my interest in the arts started in my teens, partly through my studies in music and violin, but more importantly, it's through the contemporary art scene I came across in Amsterdam, where I grew up. And this was the time of the ready-mades, the art in museums that is indistinguishable from objects that you can find outside the museums, on the streets or elsewhere. So a coat hanger, a heap of coal, famous urinal of Marcel Duchamp. And I found this immensely intriguing, and I still do actually, as it raises all kinds of philosophical questions about what constitutes art and how it distinguishes itself from other human practices and activities. So partly through those questions, I went on to study philosophy at the Free University, which Julian already mentioned, was founded as a Christian university by the Christian statesman Abraham Kuyper in the 1880s. Now, by the time I came to the university as a whole had become more or less indistinguishable from any mainstream university and had become a more or less secular university. But the philosophy department where I entered, there was still a high number of committed Christians who were very serious about the integration of their faith with their scholarship, and from whom I learned a great deal. Subsequently, I completed my master's studies in philosophical aesthetics with the, again, Christian philosopher Calvin Sierveld at the Institute of Christian Studies in Toronto. And that's the same graduate school where Jonathan and I ended up teaching later on. So what are important questions for me as a Christian philosopher? Well, philosophical aesthetics deals with many questions that interest me, but let me just mention two. First, I'm interested in aesthetics as a study of sense perception. The word aesthetics is derived from the Greek verb asthemi, which means to see, sense, or perceive. And it was the 18th century Alexander Baumgarten who first coined the word aesthetics, conceived as a science of sensuous knowing. And I've since then been particularly interested in also recent development in neuroscience, in its more accessible publications, I have to say, but that draw connections between, on the one hand, cognition and perception, and on the other hand, ways in way humans make and perceive art. Mark Johnson, for example, who represents a movement called embodied cognition, explores the nature of aesthetic understanding in relation to the embodied mind. And I find this has strong resonances with a holistic Christian anthropology. Second, I'm also interested in the question of defining art. Now, there is a visceral reluctance, you could say, in the art world to seek any definition of art or any criteria by which to evaluate it, as this is perceived to stifle and preclude creative innovation. So the current fallback is what is called the institutional theory of art, developed by Arthur Danto, amongst others. And this theory holds that any artifact that has been declared a candidate for aesthetic appreciation can be called, or is even baptized, they say, as a work of art. So it's a very wide and open definition. Now, this reluctance to commit to any particular notion of art has also created a big vacuum in which other spheres of life, you could say, not least the commercial sphere, have impinged on and have annexed the arts and redefined it as a commodity, a source of investment or a boost for tourism and economic growth, and so on. So I think precisely in order to prevent such an annexation and reductionism, it is important to raise the question what constitutes the unique and irreplaceable role, and you could say vocation, of art in the wider fabric of human life. How does it distinguish itself from other human practices? Why is it important to protect it at schools, in education, in society at large? What happens if societies proceed to neglect or misdirect or misuse it? This is not stifling creativity and innovation, but on the contrary, allows for new avenues of exploration and disclosure of God's world. In short, I see the task of defining as a normative project. Indeed, a project of spiritual discernment. And here I come to a paradox, because I found that my search for a better understanding of the nature of art in God's creation, I've often felt more drawn to insights coming from secular philosophers than from Christian theologians. Many theologians conceive art in terms of beauty and as a stepping stone from earthly beauty to so-called spiritual beauty. And it represents a move away from our concrete lived experience. And what I came to realize is that this way of thinking about art is often quite uncritically shaped more by Greek dualism or romantic idealism than by a genuinely Christian understanding of the world. So over the years I've started to work with a very different working definition, and this notion emphasizes art as an articulation of what I've called affective human experience. And this notion has been informed by my readings of secular philosophers such as John Dewey, Susanna Langer, and importantly the phenomenologist François Merleau-Ponty. So although there's nothing explicitly Christian about this definition, and I can engage in a mainstream conversation, this way of conceptualizing art is, I find, closer to my Christian understanding of the world, my Christian worldview, than these dualistic theologies, and has, I believe, greater potential for understanding and evaluating art, including obscure contemporary art in its huge variety of expressions. So let me finish with saying a few words about the seminar this afternoon, where some of these issues will be touched upon. How many minutes? Oh, okay. 6 points. Thinking about art, I start why bother? So unless we understand our visual culture, we have no means to shape it. I'm saying a little bit more about the Christian ambivalence about the arts. On the one hand, we have a very, in history of Christian thinking, a very denigrating approach. We say it's trivial, it's not important. And on the other hand, we put it on a pedestal and we think it is a step up to a spiritual reality. I analyze some of the problems with Greek and Romantic views of art. I outline a biblical framework referring to the biblical story of creation, fall, and redemption as a proper context for understanding art. Say something about defining art, and I end with 5 features which demonstrate the blessings of art for human flourishing. Can I just mention the 5? Art teaches us to see. Art is a way of making sense of the world. Art enables us to capture nuanced, pre-reflective experience. Art feeds the imagination, and finally, art nurtures empathy.